Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another Friday night live stream with your host Brandon Hicks from the Orange Guild. So tonight we're going to be continuing our celebrity likeness sculpting in Blender 2.8. This is part 4, so if you want to see the other parts, you can check those out in the YouTube videos on this channel. So if you haven't liked and subscribed yet, please go ahead and do so because I would really appreciate it, and you'll get notified as soon as we go live next time. But yeah, tonight we're going to be having a lot of fun and jumping into 2.8, and we're going to be sculpting. So if you guys want to talk about techniques or just hang out and sculpt along, feel free to do so. And in the meantime, I will be jumping in and getting started. So let me go ahead and transition my screen over, and I'll show you what we're working on. Okay, so for those of you who are just tuning in, we are doing Angelina Jolie. We've been doing her for the past 4 or so weeks, trying to build up a base, kind of get some things blocked in, and just kind of working on the overall structure of the face. So we're not into details yet. We're not doing pores or anything that crazy right now. We're just kind of focusing on making sure that all the foundation is in place so that we have a good structure there before we move on to those details. So that's kind of what we're doing tonight. We're just getting in these areas that still need some refinement, making sure that they're up to par, and then we'll talk about how to move on. So obviously there's a lot of work left to be done in the eye area, so that's kind of what I'm working on right now. And if I zoom in on my reference in the upper right hand corner here, you can see kind of what we're trying to replicate here. So at some point, I'm probably going to be creating an eye and then replacing it. But what I'm trying to do right now is not get too bogged down in those details, and instead just try to get the sort of form that's around this brow bone kind of in place. Because right now it's a little disconnected, and I need to make sure this form is kind of all following one sort of solid mass because of the way that the skin and the muscle is stretched over that bone. So there's a lot of sort of um, subtle details going on right now, which we need to bring together and just kind of smooth all this out and then go back in and decide later when to add those details. So I'm just building up the form a little bit using clay strips here. And let's take a look. All right, so I'll be popping in the chat frequently throughout tonight. Al Nasir says, you always do live streams when it's 2 a.m. here. Not exactly the best time for me. I apologize for that. I wish I could do live streams when it was convenient for everyone. But unfortunately, I'm in the States, so I apologize that it is a super inconvenient time for you. But you can always go back and watch the past ones, and maybe at some point, if I get enough feedback from people that want it changed, I'm happy to kind of adjust the schedule for the crowd. So yeah, I hear you. So I apologize for that. I hope I can do something about it in the future. Maybe get some multiple live stream times throughout the week. I don't really know yet, but yeah, I'm sorry about that. Glad you're here anyways. So okay, so after smoothing this out here, now again with the lighting, it's a little hard to tell, but the brow bone here is all kind of one piece. It's a little bit more defined because of the way the face bends around the skull here, and so I don't want a huge dip back into the skull there. I want to kind of flatten that out. So let's take our peaks or our scrape brush here, and I'm just going to gently kind of flatten that back down. Okay, that's a little better. And you'll find that, the further we get into the face, the more subtle these tweaks are going to be, almost to the point where we're not really going to be able to tell. Um, you know, in the 3D viewport, kind of what's going on. So we're just gonna have to pay attention to that and keep that in mind. Okay. So let me jump in real fast and see who we got watching. All right. So before we jump into the eye, I'm just looking at the areas surrounding the eye and making sure that I'm happy with where those are kind of landing. Okay. With a female face, it's definitely more conducive to less wrinkles. So you want to make sure that even though early on, you know, we're trying to just nail down some consistency with the forms, the more you can get in the habit of taking those back out, the better it's going to look in the final run. So, all right, I think we're getting close to a good place with the surrounding area on the eye that you see here in the reference. So let's move into the eye and start getting these forms blocked in here. All right. So I'm just going to smooth all this out because we're about to go back in and re-refine it. And I'm going to be moving around as I sculpt the surface of these lids to make sure that the dimensionality on the face is kind of curving around those eye sockets. I don't want to get into a habit of projecting those onto a flat surface and then, you know, just kind of sticking to one view here because it's going to keep these looking a little less correct. So now you'll see how deep this goes. A lot of people early on make the mistake of keeping these too close to the surface of the rest of the face, but the eye sockets are really they're really sunken in back into the face. So you want to make sure you're paying attention to that aspect and keeping the distances correct here. So I'm just pushing that back into the head a little more. And what we might do, no, I was gonna say we might want to just kind of model this with the eyes closed, but I think I'm gonna do it with the eyes open. All right, so starting at the top, we know that we've defined this sort of outer bulge where the brow bone is. We have to decide where that sort of stops and how we're gonna transition to the rest of the lids here. So just real quick, I'm gonna make sure that's where I want it. Smooth this area out. And so from the side here, let's go back to our reference on the right side. You can see that dipping in here. And if we start following in the middle of the brow down, you can see it's a fairly flat transition. It curves in a little bit and then comes back out. So I'm going to want to build up the eyelid a little bit to where it's got this sort of wrap around. And it's not quite as far out as the brow bone here, but it's going to be definitely further out than it is now. So I'm just going to gently start building this up. And you'll notice she's got two folds here on the upper eyelid. So she's got one, there's a crease where it's tucking in when she blinks around here. And then you've got the rest of her eyelid down there. Now I'm sure she's wearing some fake lashes or something there. So we'll have to, you know, compensate for that a little bit. But start with the big forms, so don't worry about the split yet, but bear in mind that's what we're moving to next. So first thing I'm doing is just building up this outer upper lid here. Okay, and now I want to start pulling in a little bit and separating these so I can build out this secondary form here. So I'm going to jump into the Crease Tool. Let's make sure we're at a good position here. And what we can do, since we already have this lined up, is jump into wireframe. And we know right about here is where that crease is from the reference. So this is the highest point, and then it kind of tapers back down. So yeah, we're pretty close. That's good. Start about there, and then just kind of go down. So get as close as we can, and then kind of do our best from there. Let's see from the front. Now, again, these reference images are different from different, probably time periods, different photographers, different settings on the lenses, all that stuff. So I'm not going to be super crucial about how these line up because I'm sure a lot of the settings are changing. But I'm just generally speaking wanting to make sure we're in the ballpark here. So I think we're doing good. I'm still trying to play with the settings here in the viewport to make sure everything's in place. So let's see, what can we do? I'm gonna hunt real fast and see what we can find for the object settings. Yeah. All right. So let's jump back over here and look at the eye. Just gonna match this up. Okay. Double check our settings here, make sure we got the dynamic topology going. Yes, we're good. Okay. So here we see a little bit of a different breakdown with the way the folds are kind of coming together. There's not as much of a separation between the two parts of the upper eyelid where that tuck is happening, because it's a little further up into this brow. So that's something to be aware of. This moves around, it's fluid, and every person's different. And you'll even see here that there's a difference in the way that the reference is looking from one picture to the next. So just be aware that that's something you're going to have to kind of interpret and decide for yourself how to handle. Okay. Okay, so we got that rounded out pretty well now. I think it's looking good. Mostly want to build this up so it's consistent in the way that it falls off all the way around. So we don't want any huge bumps or major differences going on there in this this round shape wrapping around the eyeball there. All right, so now if we want to separate this out a little bit, we've defined that crease kind of right through here, and this is coming down, not quite covering half of the eyeball, but kind of a similar area, a little further up than halfway. So let's call that good for now, and then let's move on to the lower half. I'm going to flatten this back down a little bit so that it's not so bulgy with the scrape tool. I'm just gently tracing the outer form, and I'm being very gentle with my tablet here. I'm not pushing very hard at all. We don't want to take out all of the roundness. We just want to push that back a little bit so that it's not super puffy. It's a little better there. Okay, so then we'll go back, hold shift, smooth. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing, hold shift around the bottom edge, soften up that crease where it meets the cheek. Go ahead and soften this area up as well while we're at it. Okay. So now let's kind of work a little bit more on defining the interior of these lids because they're a little bit lost here. So what we're going to want to do is I'm just using the scrape tool to flatten these planes back out a little bit. Get these all on the same level. And then once we're kind of clear on that, I'm holding shift to go back in and bring that all together. But you can see now we've got a very distinct separation from the outer part and where it dips in, and those planes are really important for the shading to be correct there. So the bottom is going to be more pronounced because we got the water line down there and we can see what's going on more. So we want to make sure we do the same thing and we gotta get this right. So just want to be ginger with it, keep it subtle. You don't want to be super intense with your strokes because you're going to want to marry these all back together again. And it's hard to do that if you're just getting here and going nuts like this all over the place. So small subtle tweaks. There we go. Alright, so now we got some definite plane separation happening there. As always, if we need to move things around, we can do it with the grab tool and kind of massage this into place. But what I'm going to do now is kind of rebuild back up with the clay brush the interior of this eye. So I want there to definitely be an eyeball inside. And what I'm trying to do is stay away from the those edges that I just refined with this scrape and the rest of the lids. So just the inside of the eye is what I'm working on. The clay brush is a great brush to use to just fill areas in without having to see a lot of strokes. It's a lot softer than the clay strips tool, so this is a perfect tool for this sort of thing. And just think of this like we're shading with cross hatching with a pen or a pencil or whatever. We're going one direction, then we're going back, and then we're same pressure, just going the other direction and stacking these layers of clay up. And doing that will keep it consistent in terms of the height, but you're going to still need to go back and smooth that out. So just make sure that you keep an eye on that. So let's keep this distance building consistent. So I'll go around. Go down from a more extreme angle like this, top down or bottom up, we can see how that's sort of paralleling the wrap of the eyelid. And you want to, again, make sure that that is consistent, because ultimately this is a sphere that's sitting inside the head here. And if it doesn't look like a sphere, then everything else is going to be off. So you just want to make sure that that is kind of what we're getting here. Pull that back a little bit. Okay. Now, if you want, you can again go ahead and drop in the lens of the eye there. Remember that your sphere is actually out here, so the lens is probably going to be cropped a little bit by the top and the bottom lids. So don't put a big circle right in here. It's going to go up into the lids a little bit on the top and bottom. So I want to kind of round this off so it's a little bit of a spherical bulge on top of the sphere of the eye. Doesn't have to be perfect. Remember, we're going to be replacing this eventually with a real eye, but it helps sell the sculpture a little bit more if you can get this correct early on. Okay, so let's go back to crease. Just make sure we've got that separation still intact. Okay. I think we're in a good position there for now. So I like to move around the face quite a bit as I work. I don't really want to stay in one area and you spend too much time focusing on all of that, because it will tend to bias you a little bit as you work. So we have a interesting sort of soft transition there from a hard edge on the lid down into where it tucks into the rest of the eye back here. And you can kind of see that fading in there, and it's hidden by the eyelashes there, but that's where it would be. And I'm going to grab the crease again and just make sure we're kind of pulling this in where it needs to be. Okay, so let's jump back to the front section of the eye here and make sure we have the rest of the structure in place there. To do that, I'm going to stick with the crease tool for now. We're going to bring this in. Just going to do that a little bit. Might build this back up a little bit with the clay strips in here. you can see kind of why it's necessary to move around here and make sure that you're not just sculpting from one angle, because from the front, you know, this looks like it's kind of matching, but when you rotate around, you'll notice that it's definitely not far back enough into the skull there. So if you want, get the grab tool and then just push this back. And then we can kind of correct that as we go. But remember, we're trying to wrap this around the surface of the eye, so do a bunch of tweaks like that. We're going to need to go back in and correct this with some smoothing. So hold shift, get these lines back in place where they need to be. Okay. So now's a good time to start asking ourselves, you know, what separation are we really seeing here? Is it textural? Is it actual 3D form? You know, what is happening in that area, and that will kind of dictate what we actually need to sculpt right now versus what we can do when we get into texturing. So smooth this back out. Okay, I'm going to define this lens a little bit more by coming in here and separating this out. Okay, so now we can see that definitely coming off of the eye shape a little bit more. And then I pulled in a little bit too far, so I'm going to go back in with the clay fill and just block that back in. Okay, then we smooth and we're good. Okay, so I'm just making sure that the lens is actually coming up off and is the highest sort of surface on this eyeball shape. And, you know, it's a game of push and pull here. We don't want to... It's not as simple as just going in and you know, doing one pass. So you want to keep that in mind as you're building this out here. So fill this area in a little bit more. It's got some more of this tissue on the other side, and make sure that is just kind of indicated there for now. Okay, so now let's work on the actual shape here of how this is all kind of coming together. Because even if the reference is a little off and is not matching up with the rest of the stuff, the overall shape should still be kind of the same. And we're definitely off on sort of the way this is looking right now. So let's grab the grab tool, and I'm going to make some bigger adjustments here. Okay, so now let's do a little bit of tweaking here. Okay, so we're building up these walls sort of surrounding the tear duct here. And if you zoom in real close, you'll notice it's harder to build up the form, so I like to stay zoomed back further so that my brush has a bigger area to fill in. And it's easier to kind of overcome the size of your brush that way, and you're not fighting it as much. Okay, so just layering this up. Okay, lost a little bit of definition there, so I'm going to undo this. Definitely want to keep the separations intact where you've added your creasing and stuff like that. So all right, let's go ahead and save. Okay, let's jump into this reference point and make sure from this angle all of that form is kind of following the same line there. And I think we definitely need to push this back into the head. So I'm going to grab. Let's try this with snake hook and see if we have a little bit better time trying to move this stuff around. All right, so I'm going to undo that. Okay, so with our current settings, we're losing a lot of that because it's retopologizing. So I'm going to undo, and then I'm going to turn off dynamic topology so that it's not affecting that. And here again, we're talking about getting that wrap to where it's working correctly. So we've got the inside of the face here, and it's flattening out, so we don't want that. We want it to be you know, this is a cavity inside the skull where it's sunken in, and you gotta remember the skull here for the eye sockets. It's an empty void. So the things that are filling this back in are your muscle tissues and you know, your fat and your cartilage and all that kind of stuff. And so you want that to follow the structure outlined by the bones, and if it doesn't, and you've got this flattened out too much, it's going to be really obvious that this is sort of fake, and it's just not going to feel right. So you'll notice from the side here, this is about how far back the tear duct on the outer edge goes. So if you think about the inner edge coming out to about here, because we're kind of still at an angle with the eyeball, that's how much it needs to wrap back around. So if we're looking here, we're still not far enough in on this. So I'm going to jump to the side, really start to pull these areas of the face back into the skull here. And that's probably a little bit more realistic in terms of how that needs to be wrapped. Okay, and then we can just go back in and kind of readjust all of those areas. So I'm not undoing what I just did. What I'm doing here is just subtly making sure the transition of this form is wrapping around and is smooth. Same thing for the inside here. We want to make sure this is it's definitely matching. Okay. Now, we're going to have to go back in and, you know, redo the tear duct again, but again, it's worth fixing the issues of, you know, how this is all shaped out and stuff, because ultimately, if we don't fix that now, it's going to be a big problem later. We're not going to be able to undo the structural problems that we've introduced. So it's better to focus on that stuff early, get that nailed down right now, even though it's not the most fun part of the process. And it can oftentimes seem like you're just kind of spinning your wheels. It's really important to make sure that that's working. So you can see, even with the scrape brush, we're not flattening that out as much as we're just kind of removing some of that volume. And I kind of prefer this over the deflate option because it's a little bit more controllable from my experience than just using the deflate tool. And also, you know, sort of mimics the way you would actually do this with clay if you were sculpting in the real world. So anytime you can get back to those basics and kind of mimic the way that you would do this from a traditional standpoint, I kind of like that because it grounds what we're doing in reality. It's deflating in the real world is it's not possible. You know, you got to scrape clay off. So that's what we're kind of doing here is making sure that we're okay. So you can see we've really gone in and deepened this cavity here for the tear duct. And that's going to be important because now we can go back in and again define those planes. So I'm going to get this outer edge built up again on the top and the bottom. Remember, we're going both directions so we can even out the application of those layers as they build up. And then when we smooth, it's going to give us that sort of rounded volume that we're looking for, but it's going to be a little bit more consistent and even. And then what we can do is jump back in with the scrape brush on the interior edges and flatten that back out. But you'll notice as I rotate, the bottom side is definitely kind of filled in where we would need it, but this top side is definitely not got enough volume on it. So let's go back in now that we've noticed that, and let's add this back in here. If you start getting these weird things going on and smoothing's not working, just make sure you hit optimize. That will clean up some of those areas where you've tried to move the geometry a little too much with dynamic topology. Alright. And all you really need for the scrape to work is to have that ridge there that you can dig back into. So now we've got this really defined edge. Do the same thing here. And we've got an unwanted crevice here, so I'm going to fill this in with clay. Smooth this out. Go back with my scrape brush. Okay. So you can see we're definitely kind of differentiating what's going on in here. And for this part, we also want to fill this back in. So we've got that edge of the eyeball kind of coming in right around there. Okay. Want a little bit more of an edge right here, so I'm using clay strips instead of clay to get that edge in there. And then we've got a very distinct separation, as you can see, with the tear duct happening. So it's definitely better than it was. Jump in here, and again, you don't want it super, separated even on a microscopic scale. You want to fill this back in because it's actually bulging out a little bit. You can tell with that highlight right there. But the point is you've gone in, you've got these surrounding areas, sort of defined and carved out in a proper way. And now when you go back in and you fill this so that tissue is back in place, it's going to be following the structure that you've outlined. So you're going to be in a better place. And if you want to, you can mask that off and make it a little easier on yourself to not touch these edges if you want. But as far as this goes, it's not too bad to just jump in with the clay tool and just fill this in. So get that little bulge back in there where the sort of inner tissue of the eye is there. And yeah, so now we can kind of soften this back down a tiny bit. Hold and shift and just kind of making sure this is all coming together here. And I like to do it that way, where you're working from a very chiseled kind of look, and then you can always go back and soften it back up, but at least you know your forms are where they need to be. Because it's harder to go the other way, where you're consistently soft and then pinpointing your problems when your model is it doesn't really have any edges it's harder to do. So I like to give myself some guides as I work. That way I know what's working and I know what's not. Okay, so jump back into the scrape tool and I'm just going to work on connecting the rest of the inside of this eye to the tear duct that we just made so that it's not got this weird sort of bulgy thing happening, because it needs to kind of be on the same plane as where this tear duct starts. So I'm going to smooth this out as I go. I don't want a hard line there. I just want a hard line where the tear duct starts. So we'll just smooth all this out. And that's better. Just that matches the transition there a lot more. So we're good. Okay, so let's turn off dynamic topology again. Let's make sure this overall shape is still intact. And right now it's a little out of whack, so let's fix this. Okay. Now, I'm going to leave dynamic topology off for now and just see if we can get away with not using it. Okay. So we're just trying to build up those separations in the form there. We got the lens of the eye that needs to be, again, going back up and under the eyelid. It needs to be round and consistent, and then we need to have the rest of the eyeball surrounding it with a sort of separation on those edges, and making sure that the plane of the eye is consistent in the way that it wraps. So I'm just digging in a tiny bit with clay strips to get that edge back. Holding shift, going back and very subtly blending that edge back in. So we don't want a huge bulge, we just want to indicate that there's a lens of the eye. As you rotate it, it shouldn't be any bumps on it. It should be very, very smooth. And we've got a little bit too much material there. We'll scrape that back out, holding control. And then just make sure our separation is in place. So we've got that edge right there. Okay, I think that's good. So from the front, if we zoom in here and we look at these outer lines of the eye, we've got, again, sort of a straighter dip right here, and that needs to be coming up a little bit on this side. And then we've got a definite, upper arc here, and then if we go left to right, it's a little higher on the outside edge, so we've got to fix that right now. And if we just make sure we're in line with the rest of the features on the face, trying to find something that matches horizontally with where this tear duct is on the inside. And if we go out, we can see that sort of the hairline reference over here is a little bit lower than where that needs to be. So we're a little high, or a little low actually right now with where this is at. And that's exactly the type of thing that we need to tweak right now. So I'm gonna grab a big brush, pull this whole thing up so we're right about where we need to be. And then for the outer edge, same thing. We're going to come up, pick something that sort of matches sort of this upper area of the ear, so you can see how far we're off here. And that needs to come up. So I'm going to grab a big brush, just experiment with the size as needed. And then dial this back down as we get further into tweaking this. Now the question is, how much of this needs to shift around the eye to accommodate? I don't want to really start tweaking the brow necessarily because we've kind of locked in where that needs to be. If we look at the features, you know, we don't have a brow with hair and everything in yet, but we do have the bone structure in place. So the real question is, you know, does this bone structure follow what the reference is showing us? And I think what we may need to do is pull up a little bit there. And again, you can see how subtle these tweaks are. We're very subtly kind of going in and tweaking this up. So again, outer edge of the eye is in line sort of right here with this tuck. And so we need to be a little higher. Okay. So the more we tweak and we push and we pull, it's the more lumpy it's going to get, and we're going to have to fix that. But again, it's more important that this structure is in the right place. Yeah, that's a lot better. Okay, so now we can go in and just kind of work on tweaking this stuff until it's where it needs to be. And I'm just digging in and pulling back out with the clay tool. There's not a lot of you know, switching up tools or anything like that here. I'm just making sure that I'm happy with what's going on. So I'm holding control, kind of digging back in here to make sure that this is following that line appropriately. Let's smooth this back out. And you can use a scrape brush too. That would be a good tool for this. Just to quickly kind of dial this back in and hold shift, go back through, and you know, just tweak that up. But you can see we've got a much more wrapped version of the eye now that's going from the inside all the way around and kind of following the contours of the face. So it's definitely more akin to something that's realistic in terms of what's going on. So the only thing that I think we're a little off on right now is how far back this actual creasing is happening. I think we need to close this off. Yeah, a little further in, maybe right here. So we'll just fill that in, smooth it out, and just figure out how to transition this this area here. So we just kind of subtly imply where that tear duct would be. And again, once you pull in with the crease tool, go back in and add a little bit of bulge with the clay to pull that tissue back out. And there you go. Make sure your forms are separated. And smooth. And we're coming off the eye pretty far with these lids, so some of that may need to be adjusted, but what we do know is that by the time we get to the outer edge of the eye, those need to be tapering back into the um, face, because we don't have as much structure, because the eye is ending, the sphere is ending over here, and it's got to wrap around. So as we lose that structure, these edges of the tear ducts and all that sort of stuff are going to be blending back into the rest of the eye socket. Okay. So we're just cleaning up the form here. Okay, so let's go back, make sure this rim is consistent. Around the eyelid here. I don't want to get too much into blending away all of these transitions here, so I'm going to be careful here. So we'll blend back in this bottom area, but we'll leave this top area alone. Now I'm digging back towards the face to get rid of a lot of this detail that's coming off a little too much from when we had to move this all back into the eye socket. Awesome. Okay, yeah, that's looking a lot better. So I'm just kind of removing some of these extra layers of fat where I feel like they're kind of getting a little too full. Okay, yeah, that's a lot better. So let's move on to some other areas of the face and just make sure that we kind of know where we're headed here and that we're happy with what's going on. And what's great is, working on this from week to week, I'm able to spend a lot of time in between, not, not working on the project. And so, what that does is it gives my brain a chance to not be obsessing about these details. So when I come back next week, I'm fresh and I've got, more objectivity and a better perspective on the project as a whole. So if you can work on these over time, it's better for I think the work, because until you've done tons of these, it's hard to stay objective. And when we're talking about objectivity here, we're really talking about training your eyes so that you're paying attention to the details and not just kind of assuming what you're seeing. And that's very hard to do because um, we're all just we have a tendency to kind of simplify things and make shortcuts in our brain. And you see a nose and you think, all right, well, I know what a nose looks like. And even if you're not consciously doing that, if you're not consciously telling yourself to avoid doing that, then your brain will tend to just take shortcuts and show you stuff that really is not helpful. So you have to constantly kind of be on your guard to make sure that you're being very mindful of what these details actually need to look like, and all of that's of course about paying attention to the reference and not not just going rogue and kind of doing your own thing here. So I'm flattening that out a tiny bit. You'll notice too that when we started tonight, a lot of this was very lumpy, and I'm going back in and smoothing this as I go. And what I like about that too is, again, as I do that, it reminds me about the passes that I'm currently doing and which areas of the face I've touched and which area of the face I haven't touched for this particular pass. So if we keep everything really blocky and kind of rough looking, like in here, I know that I've still got here. I'm on a very basic first pass. I haven't even finished the block end. These areas are a little bit lumpier, so I know that because I didn't smooth these, I've got some of the basic structure in place, but we're now needing to go back in and refine with the second level of structure. And these areas, obviously have had more detail and time thought put into them because they're smoother. So I've already worked out some of those problems. Now nothing's final. We still have a lot of things we need to do to make sure this is working, but we're headed in the right direction, which is the important thing. Okay. I'm just smoothing this out a little bit after we grab that with the move tool. I'm going to go back and kind of play with the transition of this cheek here. So I'm going to remove some of that big wrinkle separation there. Let's see. Now we know the outer edges of the nose are pretty much, perfectly in place because we've outlined that with the reference as a guide. So again, all of this is about tweaking these interior sections, looking at the reference to make sure that we're on track with how these are being adjusted. Because you'll see here, this is more of a straight line up and kind of a dip in here. And from the side angle that we have here, it's much more kind of coming off into the left, so we need to fix that. And so we could move it, but I think what I want to do is just carve into the face a little bit here. It doesn't take much. But what this can also really start to tell you is if you know that this line is really far off and you start carving into the face to line this up, and the rest of the surrounding areas are, when you start smoothing them back into the face and it's not working, you start realizing how far off you really are with all of these areas surrounding, because they need to be kind of automatically blending together if you've outlined your structure correctly. And so it'll show you automatically really how far off you were with your structure. So if you just blend and it kind of starts working, then you know, okay, well the cheek was kind of in the right place. So if the rest of this is working, then we're good. Um, you'll see here we've got a little bit of a line, and that's coming from the the bag underneath the eye, but also the intersection of where this cheek is coming down. And you can see my cheek is coming out way further than that, and there's not a separation happening there. And so we need to kind of think through that and decide, you know, why is that, and how do we fix it, and all that sort of stuff. So some of this may just be because we haven't added in a you know, a separation coming down through here. And so let's explore that possibility by adding one and just kind of quickly smoothing that back in. And yeah, I think that's what we're getting here, is not as much of a... So this time I'm not going to blend, I'm just going to see what's going on and how we need to kind of fix this. So I'm being pretty subtle here, trying not to just dig too much into all this form. But, you know, again, if it shows you that you're off, you need to fix it. Don't be afraid to get in here and make some big adjustments if it's necessary. Okay, so straight down, off to the left. So we need to, again, play with this form. And we're definitely getting there. So I'm going to add a little bit of this back. You can see how much I'm kind of going in all directions, cross-hatching here. But yeah, now we've got that straight down that follows that contour. And it's very subtle in the reference, but it's very important. So now we've got the separation in that cheek, and that's telling me how the folds are really happening. You can actually see it here a little bit, even though the lighting is really blending all this together. You got a big dip happening underneath this sort of secondary part of the eye socket here. Then you've got sort of a bulge coming out, and then it dips back in towards the nose and then underneath the cheekbone. So all stuff that we need to pay attention to make sure that we're kind of headed in the right direction. So I'm going to add a little bit more volume to smooth this back out, hold shift, and then go back in and just make sure this is all blended. And now we can support all of that because structurally we know that we're ballpark headed in the right direction. Now, we've still got problems. We don't have the separation that we need to have there because we just kind of got rid of a lot of that. So instead of just creasing, what we need to do is actually separate this back out. So I'm going to hold control to kind of carve back in on this area. And we got a little bit of a separation here with the plane starting to form. So that's what we're wanting. So I'm going to subtly build up in two directions using the subtraction, smoothing back out here. But you'll notice as I do that, when I blend, we're starting to get more and more of a defined line between this area and this area. And that's because they're actually in different places in 3D space. So this needs to tuck way back in underneath here. So now I'm going to grab my crease brush, dig in like this, and then we can go back and we'll start working on that separation. Now, we've automatically got a bulge sort of happening on the bottom side, so I'm not going to undo that. In fact, I'm going to add more material to enhance that on the underside. You can see me with the clay strips brush building this up. And on the top side, I'm blending back in, but on the bottom side, I'm leaving that edge alone. So here we need to go in even further. So I'm really going to dig in there with that crease brush. And then I'm going to let's grab this scrape brush and use that to help speed this up a little bit more. I'm gonna zoom in, really dig this back, because this is more of a sort of a 30-degree angle or so back in there. And that's going to help kind of, again, wrap this around a spherical shape of the eye here. So you can see that going in there. And now what we need to do is remove the extra material around the bottom side so that it blends in with the cheek, because we don't want an extra wrinkle there. So what I'm going to do before I do that is, again, grab the crease brush and finish this out on that side. Now we can do the same thing over here. Just blending, blending, blending with shift. Okay, now let's start removing this back out. So grab the scrape brush and we're just going to chisel this back out until we're back down to that same layer on the face. So I'm going to grab a bigger size here. I'm actually not going to do that, because if I do that, then it's going to start removing detail. So let's turn off dynamic topology, and then let's start scraping. Now again, same principle, we're going to go both directions, not just one, so that this is evenly removed. And do it in passes, don't do it all at once. And you're going to start removing a little less and less as you get further down into this area. But now you can see we get a really good separation happening as we get to where this is starting to blend back in with the face. Then we're in a good spot. So hold shift, blend that back in. We'll zoom out a little bit more, and then when we hold shift and smooth, it's going to take out even more of those lumps. So just blend, blend, blend. Cheek is very smooth, especially with you know, makeup on and all sorts of stuff like that. So you want to keep that in mind. All right, let's take a look where we need to go next. Save. All right, I'm gonna get a drink of water. All right, we're back. Okay, so let's look from the side again. And yeah, we're a lot better off now. We've got clear separation happening. We've got a little bit more movement that needs to happen to line this up, but we're definitely in a better place as far as the separation goes. And then on the side of the nose, we've got the same thing going on, where we just need to dial this in. So let's grab the clay brush here, and I'm going to leave the dynamic topology off for now. And I'm just holding control, and I'm gently going back in and pushing this back into the face. Okay. So working our way down. Again, you can see that there. So we want to pull this across, smooth. And there we go. You can see that matching up a lot better now. And again, that tells us how far off we are with the rest of this cheek. So we need to definitely go back in and tweak that now. So just holding control. Starting to get some weird artifacts, so let's remesh or optimize. Hold shift, and I'll get rid of those. And what this is really showing is just how much extra fat and stuff that we had on the face, which was kind of doing us a disservice here. So, we definitely want to get that wrangled in and under control. All right. So let's fix some of this low poly stuff going on here with the edge of the nostrils. So once again, I'm digging in, I'm going back, and I'm adding more form on top with layering. And then when we smooth all that back out, it should feel a little bit more correct there. So let's grab a bigger size. Just subtly start filling the cheek back in over there. Okay, let's grab the crease. We really want to start separating these forms out, so and from a distance, Crease is really good at, kind of digging back in and coming back with a clay takes out a lot of those big dips in. But, we're talking about moving subtle amounts of form around here on the face, and this is a great way to do it. So let's grab Crease again. You'll notice here we've got this coming up around the nostril, and then we also have this area here that needs to kind of come around, and they're kind of connected in a way. If we just subtly stroke that in there, you can kind of see what's going on. Grab the clay, subtract this out with control. So let's flatten out a little bit more. And there you go. Okay, so I'm going to pick one area to focus on, which is this outer shape here. Let's get a grab tool going on. Just want to kind of round this out a little bit more. Something kind of like that. And again, we're not trying to move the nose around so much as we're just getting these lines kind of pushed into place. We've already established those lines, so we don't want to lose that. Okay, let's get the grab tool. Okay, so now I'm paying attention to the 3D forms that are kind of here. Now, you've got some definite separation from the underside of this nostril to the rest of the upper lip, so that needs to be put in there so that it's blending correctly. So we're going to build this form up. Kind of think of this as a tube of some kind. It's kind of a donut. We're going to blend this back into the rest of the surrounding forms, but now you can see we've got some definite separation happening there. So if we do kind of a subtle scrape, that's going to flatten out that definition a little bit, but it's going to help. Now I'm going to inflate this area around the nostril and the outside edge a little bit more, and that's going to make it easier to not have to, manually go in with clay strips and try to keep this interior crease in place. Because I want to just get this blended and add in some of that. So I'm just adding a little bit of inflate, going back and holding shift to kind of blend that back out. Now the trouble with doing that a lot is that you're going to lose any of those edge definitions that you've created. So What we're going to need to do once we've got this area worked out correctly is go back onto the rest of the surface and make sure that our forms are in place. So I'm going to hold Control, flatten that out a little bit. And then I'm going to blend just on the form on the top, and then I'm just going to blend on the form on the bottom. And what that's doing is it's not erasing this sort of subtle edge line that we have going on here that's connecting from the back to the front. And that's what we need to keep in place. So it's good. All right. So let's see if there's anything else on the nose we need to tweak at this stage. There's always opportunities to further refine these subtle separations in the form. So you can see with all these little shadows that we have going on and stuff that there's a lot of planes that are actually happening in the structure of this nose. And it's, you know, it just goes to show every single human is very unique in the way that these planes sort of fit together. So you just want to be mindful of that as you're kind of working here. If it gets a little too intense, just subtly go back in with clay and fill in that area. Okay. I feel like we're getting a little too rounded off on this underside, so I'm gonna grab the scrape tool and just subtly kind of make sure we're blended. Now again, you gotta be careful. Don't push this too hard because you're gonna start reshaping the nose profile, and that's not what we want to do here. We're just moving around these interior definitions so that they're matching up more consistently with the reference. So I'm not even sure if you can see what I'm doing here, but I'm scraping off, just planing off a little bit of this area so that it matches the flatness that you see in this sort of triangular section here on the nose. And it's super subtle, but it's, you know, it's important. It's important if you want to get a likeness going. Okay. So what we're seeing here on the front side of the face is that these areas that sort of dip in and out connecting to the upper lip, they're kind of tucking into the interior of the nostril, which we're definitely missing here. So we need to make sure we're adjusting that. And I'm going to add a little bit more form here. Just blend this back in a little bit. And then just make sure we're deciding where to connect that appropriately. So from a side perspective, we're not seeing as much of that, so we just need to be careful that we're doing this correctly. So yeah, all right. So right about here, I'm gonna dig in a little bit and then come back out, and those need to come down and connect. We're just going to build that up, connect it, and then we'll smooth. Okay, there we go. It's looking a lot better now. Too strong, but we're heading in the right direction. So we'll blend a little bit more. Soften that up. Okay. So what we're missing is a little bit more of a straight separation because it's very tight in that corner right there. So I'm going to go back in with crease. Just make sure we're paying attention to that. Smooth again. So now you can see we've tightened that up to match that outer corner on the reference there. Let's fill that back in with clay so that that crease doesn't go through these ridges here. And I'm just going to subtly make sure these edges are back where they need to be. Okay, so this is going to dip into the upper lip here. Okay, it's looking a lot better, guys. We're getting there. It's always hard to with the clay form to really tell how close you're getting without starting to add some textures in there. So at some point before the end of the year, maybe we'll go through and start throwing in some textures on the face. Got a lot of work to do in the mouth to make sure it's in a good place. So if we're sure that we're kind of in a good place with the nose, then we can proceed to the mouth. So one thing I'm noticing here is that this upper connection with the face is still feeling a little off in terms of these definitions on the ridges of the nose there. So I'm gonna add in a little bit of, you know, subtle tweaks here and there. Go back in with the clay real fast and flush some of this out. I don't want it to feel bony, you know, I want it to feel full. So I'm gonna add in a little bit there, take out a little bit through here. you can see from the shadowing on the sides of the nose how close or how far away we are from accomplishing that. So this is blending in a little bit more around here, which is telling me that the planes are meeting up. So we need to just make sure we're aware of that. Okay, I think that's a little better. Alright, so let's move on to the mouth. Okay, so this area is pretty important because it's one of the leading, what I would say, defining characteristics of her as a celebrity. So we're gonna want to make sure we pay close attention to the forms. It's tempting to jump in and just make sure this is looking perfect right away, but remember we're doing this in passes. So we've already established a big first layer of structure by wrapping this around the skull. So you can see from an extreme angle here how far this is wrapping around the face, which is what we want. We've gone in and we've created a secondary pass of structure in the lips, and now we're going to go back in and just make sure everything's lined up before we move on to the third pass, which is going to be tying this all together. So first thing I'm going to do is jump over, take a peek here. Okay. So now is the time to make any big sweeping changes that we need to make. Because remember, we moved the cheek around, which is going to change how this blends and all of that. So I'm going to blend a little bit more just to get rid of some of these details that we already threw in, because we're going to get rid of those anyways and add those back in. But I know the outline is pretty much in place where it needs to be, but you can see we're not blended into the face the way that we want yet. So we just need to make sure there's no extra clay where it doesn't need to be, and then we can, build the layers back up as needed as we go. There's a lot of three-dimensional form separation and stuff going on in there, so you can keep that in mind as we go. Okay, so let's start with the lower lip is actually protruding slightly further out than the upper, which is kind of interesting. So we've got a pretty interesting draft angle that comes from the top straight down into the bottom of the lip here, which we've already kind of defined. But now we want to make sure that that's locked in as far as the structure goes. So what I'm going to do is go back and just rebuild this form back up until it's feeling appropriate. So I'm not going to worry about the lower lip problems right now. In fact, we're gonna kind of carve in and just let that recede because there's so much going on with the way these overlap that we're gonna need to kind of deal with these one at a time. So I'm going to work general to specific. Let's take the Crease Tool and just kind of see. Let me undo this real fast. Make this a lot smaller. Okay, so that's kind of what we're seeing here. If we switch into a wireframe view, we can actually line this up with the reference and make sure we're pretty close, which it looks like. Yeah, looks like we're pretty close. So it comes back a little further, back to there, and it probably dips a little lower, but it's kind of the form we're going for with the upper lip. Now remember, this is just kind of drawn on right now, and we need to actually have the form reflecting how this is sort of shaping in. So I'm gonna go dig out from underneath the lip here. Smooth that back down. Okay. Let's grab our scrape tool. I'm going to flatten this area out so it's a little bit more planar here. So we've got a flatter area that wraps back to the cheek here, and then we have a sort of a bulge before we connect to the actual lip, and that's sort of flatter and again wrapping. So you can see what I'm doing with the scrape brush is just making sure there's a little bit of a separation between this section and this section. And it's not really a defined line, it's just there's a little bit of differentiation there with the form. So just helps make it clearer what's going on with the lip there. Alright, so now let's tackle sort of the overall structure of the lower lip again. And I learned a cool trick from Ryan Kingsline, which is to go in once you've got your lips kind of defined and kind of inflate, and it pushes the separation together between the lips and kind of just makes them feel a bit more full. So we'll try that here in a second. Okay, so it needs to all kind of blend back in here. Make sure these lines and these contours are kind of being followed. And again, we're not paying any attention to the interior strokes or the texture on the lips now. What we're just doing is making sure that these main forms are in place. So same sort of thing we had on the upper lip here with the flattened areas that are separating here, which you can't really see, but you know the shift is there in the form. We're doing the same thing on the lower lip here. So as this wraps, we're going to have an area underneath the lip that is going to be sort of flattened back out. As you can see there. And that's going to be wrapping around all the way down to the chin here. Okay, so let's go ahead and really make sure that this under area is defined on this lip. So I'm going to want to pull this area out a little bit more again. And then I'm going to push the under area back in with control. Smooth that out. Again, don't go back over the outer edge of that edge that you just created. Make sure that you're only smoothing on the two separate surfaces and leaving that edge defined, because you don't want to lose that edge. Okay, so let's just look again with the reference. If it's not lining up, you can always do the grab tool. Again, I'd switch the dynamic topology off, and then we can just kind of realign. Okay, so any of those tweaks that we do, of course, we're going to have to readjust, as always with the grab tool, it seems. But it is a nice, quick way to kind of get things blocked in there. Alright, so let's grab the scrape, and you'll notice all throughout tonight I'm using 2 or 3 tools, and that's really all it takes. You know, if you really want to diversify that, you can, but it's really not even necessary. There's a lot you can do with just a few tools. So okay, so let's take a look at defining the planes on the lower lip a little bit better. So here we've got where this is dipping in. We've got a definite plane running around the interior of the lip. So we'll get that put in there. And I'm just scraping, holding shift, going back and separating that out. So that's this area here. And then we've got a pretty bulgy area on both sides of the lip here. And then we've got another plane that sort of dips in on this underside. The main thing we need to do too is make sure that this plane on the lower part of the lip, where the mouth actually ends and starts getting into the chin, is separate, so we're not losing an opportunity to differentiate those planes. So you can see here I'm just flattening this area out a little bit, and it's starting to show this edge here on the outside of the lip. the more I kind of tweak this here. So let me smooth. Once again, scrape. Smooth again. All right, so let's take a peek here with where these lips are lining up. Yeah, we're definitely off. So we're gonna want to, instead of scraping here, I'm gonna jump back in and just use my, or instead of using the grab brush, I'm just gonna jump back in here and use my scrape tool because we've just added a little bit too much. Okay, so let's move this line back into here again. Just holding control, and we're digging in here. Okay, so now we're back to normal. That's good. We want to flatten back out this part of the lower lip. It's getting a little too rounded off there, so just gingerly kind of brushing that back in. And then as needed, we'll go back in and again further separate that sort of hook that we're seeing from here to here. Okay, that's better. All right, let's jump in with the crease again, and this time we're going to play a little bit with the curves, I think, to just make sure we're happy with where this is going. I really want to be able to kind of dig in without affecting these surrounding areas. So I'm going to get this curve dialed in here. Okay, so pulling that straight across definitely creates a separation, but it's not the separation that matches her face. So let's undo this until we get back to before we've kind of tweaked that. Let's go back to sort of a front view here, and then let's kind of follow the contours that we see. So remember, we got asymmetry really playing a part here, so we're not going to be able to get this dialed in perfectly, but we definitely want to pay attention to the dips that are sort of differentiating her mouth shape here. Jump into the side view, make sure this is sort of still lining up correctly. Okay, so we've got the separation kind of in place now. Want to make sure before I move on that that line is actually in the right place. So I'm going to undo this again, and we're going to start, instead of from the front, from the side. And I'm just going to make some visual markers so that we know we're in the right place. Because with the front, remember, we're looking at a very flat sort of definition there of where that starts and stops. And almost. Alright, so I'm going to save again. Let's jump into the side view and just make some visual markers before we commit. So it's telling me that, you know, that's coming around there. And from the side, you know, I can go ahead and finish this part of this out. But then I'm going to switch to the front to get the rest of this in here. So again, make sure you're paying attention how crooked that line is on the lip. It's not always as straightforward as, you know, just painting across. So okay. So that's definitely more characteristic of how her mouth is formed there. All right, so let's grab the inflate. I'm going to turn off dynamic topology. And we're going to inflate these lips a little bit. Okay, I'm not going to do that from a distance because it's going to ruin the sort of shape that we've already created. So instead, I'm just going to inflate closer to the mouth here where the separations are happening. And that's going to bring these together. Okay, so there we go. See how that ties that separation? There's a little bit more of a bulge on the top and the bottom, and it just makes it feel like the lips are fuller. All right, guys, that's about it for me for tonight. I'll be back next week at 7 p.m. continuing the likeness sculpt. But we are in a good place. We've got a lot done tonight to further enhance this, and I'm happy with where this is going. So these will be these files will be up on the Google Drive link in the description. So check that out. Yeah. So there's a lot going on with the guild. If you guys haven't, definitely subscribe to the channel. Check out the other videos, and go to the orangeguild.com to check out more training for Blender. So had a good time hanging out with you guys tonight. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will be back next week. Friday nights, 7 p.m. Central Time is when we stream. So I will see you then. Thanks.